The series begins in New York City in the year 1900 at 7:30 a.m. Dr. John Thackeray is awakened from his slumber in a Chinese brothel/opium den by the prostitute that he has appointed as his personal alarm clock. Outside, he instructs the driver of a hansom cab to take him to the Knickerbocker Hospital by a specifically inefficient route, and then climbs in the back where he removes an expensive white brogue and injects a solution of cocaine between his toes. In the operating theater of the Knick, Dr. Thackeray has joined his mentor, Dr. Jules Michael Christensen, for an experimental cesarean surgery assisted by Drs. Chickering and Gallinger. After the removal of the fetus, the surgeons fail to prevent the mother's fatal hemorrhaging, and Nurse Elkins's efforts to resuscitate the child are equally unsuccessful. Despite assurances from Dr. Thackeray that they will perfect this procedure, Dr. Christensen retires to his office and ends his life with a bullet to the temple, traumatizing. After Thackeray delivers a stirring, if self-aggrandizing eulogy to all in attendance at the funeral, Cornelia Robertson walks back to the Knick, accompanied by the hospital's financial manager Herman Barrow, to serve as her father's proxy at a meeting of the Board of Trustees. After discussing the hospital's annual deficit of $30,000 and promoting Thackeray to chief of surgery, Cornelia broaches the matter of appointing a new deputy chief. Thackeray believes that Gallinger is the obvious choice, but Cornelia places Harvard graduate Algernon Edwards into candidacy. Despite proclaiming that he stands firm in his decision, Thackeray agrees to meet with him. As part of a dubious deal with Barrow for increased business, Knickerbocker ambulance coachman Tom Cleary and Eldon Pouncey employ bats to extort the patient of drivers from a competing hospital. Upon delivery, Barrow promises to settle up at the end of the month. On rounds, Dr. Gallinger presents to Thackeray a patient with pelvic damage after being struck by a streetcar. After examining his sutures, Thackeray viciously dresses down new nurse Lucy Elkins for failure to clear the drainage tube of clogs. Moony-eyed Dr. Chickering attempts to console her with humor, but to no avail. Cleary and Pouncey accompany police officer Finney Sears and health inspector Jacob Spite to the ghetto apartment of a woman with tuberculosis to take her against the protests of her husband. As the woman is placed in the ambulance, Spite extorts the building's owner for hush money. A well-dressed black man arrives at the Knick looking for Thackeray, and Barrow directs him to the boiler room. There, he interrupts Thac's construction of experimental equipment and introduces himself as Algernon Edwards. Thackeray admits that Edwards' credentials are impressive and suggests he find work with a Negro infirmary, as he is not interested in an integrated staff. Inspector Spite meets with Barrow in his office and is paid a founder's fee for bringing the TB patient to the Knick. Cornelia employs the patient's daughter to translate the dire news that her disease is fatal. The young girl then expresses concern that she will be late for her work shift, and Cornelia puts her in a cab. She then accosts Thackeray for his treatment of Edwards, and they argue the wisdom of spearheading social change by employing a Negro doctor whose ministrations no patient would allow. As leverage against Thackeray's resistance, the Robertsons rescind their monetary backing of the hospital's electrification project. Barrow has hired Edwards against Thackeray's wishes and introduces him to Drs. Gallinger and Chickering. Edwards recommends immediate surgery for Gallinger's patient, but Gallinger rejects his help and asks after Thackeray. He is a no-show, and Nurse Elkins is sent to retrieve him from his home. There she finds Thack in the throes of cocaine withdrawal, having spent the night resisting the drug. He implores Lucy to inject him, but she is unable to find an uncollapsed vein, so he has her administer the drug to the underside of his ding-dong. Surprisingly, he recovers and is able to go to the hospital. In surgery, Thackeray decides to inject the patient's spine with cocaine to suppress pain and prevent shock. He then performs the procedure successfully, and Edwards vows to remain until he learns everything that Thack has to teach. In the second episode, we open on a shot of Algernon Edwards, waking up next to a gigantic cockroach. You may think your eyes are deceiving you, but no, this is just the daily vermin he must live with. Because, despite his honors and titles, he's still a black man, forced, unlike his downtown townhouse living colleagues, to reside in a boarding house in Midtown, which back then was known as the Tenderloin and was the roughest part of Manhattan. Here he has to wait in a line every morning to use the only bathroom in the whole building. This episode's title comes from a conversation between the same doctor and a significantly worse-off African-American black man, as Algernon has to explain he got his fancy shoes over in Paris, not impressing the poor man next to him much. Just this one brief scene gives us so much insight into the low-life and upper-class man like Edwards must live, all because of the color of his skin. Meanwhile, Cornelia is butting heads with the patriarchal world in which she exists. Her father, Captain August Robertson, insists she keep up with it because, as he puts it, if you were a man, you'd be running this damn city by now. Seeing the stories of Cornelia and Algernon juxtaposed against one another, the contrast between African Americans and women and their status is very present from the start. At the hospital, they've stuck Algernon in a basement storage room that they've barely converted into an office. Despite his expertise, he's never allowed to do surgery and only rarely allowed to treat patients at all. We see him giving a little girl stitches for a gash in her arm while her mother looks on, palpably disgusted at the fact that this black man has to touch her child at all. With every stitch, she seems to be physically holding herself back from smacking the doctor's hands away and taking her bleeding child home still bleeding. Even more than that, Dr. Edwards notices a black woman trying to get medical attention, but the Knick won't accept black patients. This is highly distressing to Edwards naturally, prompting him to start figuring out a way to accept African Americans for service, albeit without anyone else knowing. Meanwhile, the death of Dr. Christensen still weighs heavily on Thack. He remembers moments in time with the now deceased doctor. Christensen wanted to study the dead in order to help the living with diseases such as tuberculosis, syphilis, and so on. Little inklings of how Thackeray got to the Knick come out after he reveals having done work with Captain Robertson in Nicaragua. Interesting. Anyways, John talks with Christensen's wife, Catherine, whose pain and suffering is also running rampant. She worries about John, that it all may take its toll on him, but he replies, "I have ways of getting through." The plot thickens as two patients arrive, both about to die of aortic aneurysms. Dr. Thackeray's normal procedure involves surgically removing the aneurysm and sewing the aorta back together, which mostly just kills patients. As for other methods, when he was living in France, Dr. Edwards learned about a galvanic technique that was much more successful. But of course, the other doctors think nothing of the black man's work, believing themselves to be better than him. So they basically give Edwards an even more withering version of the "you think you're better than me" look and go perform their useless procedure on one of the patients, which only succeeds in exploding blood all over their faces, making snobbish Dr. Gallinger whine like a little baby and an effectively dead patient. Dr. Thackeray is now finally able to admit that maybe the surgery isn't the best solution, and they should try the French procedure, a procedure that Dr. Edwards has performed before, that he knows how to do, and that he told them about in the first place. But instead of even considering consulting him, they come up with a brilliant plan. Break into the office of an uptown doctor who gets the European medical journals and find what they think might be a paper describing the procedure in one of them, despite the fact that none of them reads French. On top of all this, Dr. Thackeray also has to deal with the fact that Nurse Elkins saw his privates a few days ago when she injected cocaine directly into it, and she now seems to be avoiding him. But from the look on her face while he lectures her about how they should keep their private and public lives separate, we see that she's been ducking him less because of the compromising position she found him in and more because she's got a full-blown crush on her boss. And that's the least of Dr. Thackeray's problems this week, because in addition to trying fruitlessly to stitch up hearts while dodging the advice of the one person who can help him, he's also trying to weather the botched installation of the hospital's electrical grid. A few days ago, during a routine cauterization, a fire started. Then a nurse got electrocuted to death. This all truly drives Thackeray mad. He and Cornelia go to see Barrow, who accuses the contractor of wrongdoing. Herman looks slightly nervous about it all, wanting to speak with the contractor himself instead of rushing right to the courts. Finally, we see Herman meeting with the man who supposedly did the electrical work, Clarence Mulkeen. Turns out, Mulkeen is an Irish electrician / mobster, who of course didn't do a particularly good job. And of course, Barrow embezzled money meant to go towards the renovations, which prompted the bad work, and now Clarence is trying to squeeze a ton more money out of Barrow to fix it, which is a real problem for Barrow, since he is already in debt to some other, scarier Irish mob for $9,000. Barrow tries to negotiate a loan extension with the remarkably stereotypical mob boss Bunky Collier, who reacts with another example of "you think you're better than me" in this episode, and then he proves that he's not. Meeting with Bunky Collier down in a room with the same thugs who'd come to find him, Herman is in the whole $9 grand and sweating around the collar. In fact, he's sweating all over. Bunky is not a man to be messed with. He slams Barrow against the desk, putting a small pair of pliers in Herman's mouth and roots out a tooth. Nasty chap, this Bunky. Oh, also, we get a glimpse of a nun who performs abortions. No further explanations, just confusion about why she doesn't work in a hospital. That night, Edwards gets back to his hotel to find his friend from the bathroom line lying in wait, ready to beat him up for being so fancy and take his shiny shoes while he's at it. But the good doctor gets the better of him and knocks him out cold. Then he comes back and leaves 2 bottles of medicine next to his attacker's unconscious body for when he wakes up. Because yes, in fact, he's better than you. Cut to John in the opium den once more. He's having a shave, both eyes bloodshot and weary. Ping-Wu gets his money, then Dr. Thackeray heads out with his medical bag in tow. The guy all but lives there. Strolling out, he's headed to work, I imagine.